Hurry! They've seen us! The boat's right way!
Priests.
Hurry!
When famine hit, medieval people didn't panic. They turned to crops modern society abandoned. Hardy, nutrient-rich foods that could grow in poor soil, survive frost, and fill a belly when nothing else would. These were the quiet heroes of survival, overlooked, underappreciated, but absolutely essential. Today, we're rediscovering the ancient crops that fed Europe through war, plague, and winter. And at the end, we'll reveal one grain that disappeared for centuries and is now staging a comeback you won't believe. Let's get into it. Broad beans. The survival legume. Long before potatoes or canned goods, peasants leaned on a humble but powerful food. Broad beans, also known as fava beans. They weren't glamorous, they weren't refined. But when everything else failed, they were still there, filling bellies, adding protein, and lasting deep into winter. Fava beans were easy to grow even in poor soil. Their deep roots helped fix nitrogen in the earth, improving the soil for future crops, meaning they didn't just feed people, they helped feed the land too. When stored dry, they could last years without refrigeration. In monasteries, entire garden plots were dedicated to broad beans. Monks ate them boiled into stews, mashed into pastes, or even baked into rough loaves with barley or rye. In peasant homes, they were tossed into soups and porridge, or ground into flour when grain was low. What made them special wasn't just their versatility, it was their staying power. Broad beans didn't rot quickly. They didn't need salting, pickling, or drying. They could sit quietly in a sack in the corner of a cold room and still be edible in February, long after the cabbage had wilted and the meat was gone. During famines, a single barrel of broad beans could stretch across months. Families rationed them carefully, counting every handful. And while nobles turned their noses up at these common beans, those same beans were quietly saving lives. Today, we talk about protein substitutes and climate-resilient crops. But the truth is, medieval peasants already knew the answer. It was sitting in the dirt the whole time. Turnips. The cold weather lifesaver. When the cold set in and fields froze solid, medieval peasants turned to a root that never let them down: the turnip. Turnips were fast-growing, hardy, and didn't need rich soil or warm temperatures. They could grow late into the season and were often one of the last things pulled from the ground before snow covered everything. And unlike many crops, turnips offered double utility. You could eat both the leafy tops and the hardy root. They stored easily in root cellars or even buried in straw-lined pits outdoors. In some regions, peasants layered them with damp sand to keep them from shriveling through winter. Even months later, a turnip could be pulled out, boiled, and still offer life-saving calories. And despite their reputation today as bland or animal feed, turnips were incredibly versatile. Boiled into stews, mashed with herbs, roasted near the fire, or grated and fried on hot stones. They could stretch meat rations or stand on their own when meat was gone. Some families even made turnip ale, a fermented drink brewed when grain was too scarce to spare for beer. In war, famine, and plague years, when trade routes were blocked and harvests failed, turnips saved villages. And they didn't just feed people, they fed animals too, which meant milk, labor, and wool survived the winter right alongside them. So, next time you see a turnip sitting ignored at the market, remember, it once carried entire families through the coldest months. Not because it was loved, but because it never gave up. Sorrel and nettles, medicinal greens. When the snow melted and the ground softened, medieval peasants didn't rush to plant. They rushed to forage. The first signs of spring came not in fields, but along hedgerows and forest paths. And two of the most prized discoveries were sorrel and nettles, wild greens that weren't just edible, but essential. Sorrel brought a sharp, citrusy flavor to otherwise bland diets. It was packed with vitamin C, helping prevent scurvy and reviving immune systems after winter. Nettles, despite their sting, were a powerhouse of iron, calcium, and other key minerals. But these plants did more than nourish. Healers brewed them into teas to treat fevers, used them in salves for wounds, and combined them with vinegar or honey as natural tonics. In monasteries and folk traditions alike, nettle was known as the blood builder, said to cleanse the system and restore vitality. And their use wasn't just about survival. It was ritualized. In many villages, the first foraging of nettles marked the turning of seasons. Children were taught exactly how to pluck the youngest shoots without injury. Women gathered them at dawn when the leaves were freshest. Sorrel was often the first green served at spring feasts or religious festivals, symbolizing rebirth and health. But this knowledge wasn't written down. It was oral tradition, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, healer to apprentice. In an age without textbooks or microscopes, survival depended on memory, knowing what to eat, when to pick it, and how to use it safely. Because misidentification could be deadly. Some wild plants looked similar, but were toxic. The wrong leaf in the pot could turn medicine into poison. So these greens weren't just food, they were a test of skill, a ritual of recovery, and proof that survival wasn't always about strength. Sometimes it was about knowing where to look. Lupins, the bitter bean that fed Europe. Lupins weren't easy food. They were bitter, tough, and dangerous if eaten raw. But for medieval peasants, they were worth the effort. These beans grew in poor, sandy soil where other crops wouldn't take root. And once harvested, they offered high levels of protein, fiber, and fat, a rare combination for a peasant diet. But there was a catch. Lupins were toxic unless prepared properly. So, peasants developed a system passed down for generations. The beans were soaked in running water for days, sometimes in cloth bags tied to riverbanks, then boiled, rinsed, and often fermented. It was time-consuming and laborious, but once finished, lupins became a powerful source of nutrition during times of scarcity. What made them even more valuable was what they did to the soil. Lupins are nitrogen fixers, plants that restore nutrients to depleted farmland. That made them perfect for crop rotation. A field that grew lupins one year could support grains the next, even without manure or chemical fertilizers. So while nobles overlooked them and city markets ignored them, rural communities relied on lupins to keep the cycle of survival going. A bitter bean that took work, but gave more than it took. Today, lupins are being reintroduced in regenerative agriculture and plant-based nutrition. But centuries ago, they were already doing double duty, feeding hungry families and healing tired soil, hard to love, hard to forget. Barley, the backbone of peasant porridge. Barley didn't shine. It wasn't refined like wheat or rare like spices, but it was everywhere, and it was everything. In medieval Europe, barley was the grain that showed up when others failed. It grew in poor soil, tolerated harsh weather, and produced generous yields. When wheat crops faltered or famine struck, barley stood firm. Peasants used it in nearly every meal. It was ground into coarse flour for bread, boiled into thick porridge, mixed into soups to stretch a pot further. Barley didn't impress, but it filled you up, slowly, steadily, and without fuss. It was also brewed into low-alcohol beer, called small beer, that was safer to drink than water. This drink provided hydration and calories, even for children. In many villages, a day began and ended with barley in some form. And barley wasn't just for people. It fed the animals too, chickens, pigs, horses. That made it the backbone not just of the kitchen, but of the whole food system. When barley did well, the village did well. It wasn't a grain for celebration. It was a grain for survival. And in hard times, survival is what mattered most. Parsnips, the sweet root before potatoes. Before the potato became Europe's favorite starch, there was the parsnip. It was sweet, versatile, and could survive in conditions that made other crops fail. In fact, some medieval households valued it so much that entire meals were built around it, especially in the colder months when almost nothing else grew. Parsnips thrived in poor soil. They matured slowly, but when left in the ground through a frost, they grew even sweeter. That made them ideal for long seasons and unpredictable weather. But what truly gave parsnips value was their flexibility. They weren't just boiled or mashed. In some regions, parsnips were grated and baked into simple cakes, or simmered with dried fruit and honey to make primitive desserts. Families sometimes roasted them with wild herbs, or fermented them into a kind of light, earthy mead when grains were too precious to waste on drink. And beyond the kitchen, parsnips had symbolic value. In parts of Britain and Central Europe, they were used in harvest festivals as signs of endurance, food that outlasted the cold and promised survival through spring. But over time, they were overshadowed. When potatoes arrived from the New World in the 16th century, they quickly replaced parsnips as the go-to root. Potatoes grew faster, stored better, and yielded more calories per acre. Yet in the centuries before that shift, parsnips were the reliable backbone of countless winter diets. And now, as people rediscover forgotten food traditions, they're finding their way back into gardens, kitchens, and survival plans. They weren't just a side dish, they were the main course, when little else remained. Wild leeks and garlic, food and remedy in one. Not everything that fed medieval peasants came from a field. Some of the most powerful foods came from the forest floor. Wild leeks and garlic weren't just for flavor, they were medicine disguised as seasoning. In early spring, when bodies were weak from months of grain and dried roots, these foraged plants were the first sign of recovery. Wild leeks added pungency to soups and pottages, and were especially prized after a winter without fresh vegetables. Garlic, meanwhile, was both food and defense. It boosted immunity, fought infection, and was believed to protect against disease and bad air. Midwives and healers used garlic in crushed poultices for wounds. Cooked into stews, it helped digestion. Eaten raw or steeped in vinegar, it was used to treat colds and fevers. These plants were abundant and easy to identify, passed down from generation to generation as staples of spring foraging. They were among the first things children were taught to spot in the woods, because they weren't just ingredients. They were part of the survival toolkit. Even today, garlic is known for its antibacterial properties. But centuries ago, it was already doing the job, quietly, effectively, season after season. Rye, the dual-edged grain. While wheat was the grain of the wealthy and barley was the peasant workhorse, rye was the grain that often stood between survival and starvation, especially in the colder, wetter regions of Europe. Unlike wheat, rye didn't need perfect conditions. It could thrive in acidic soil, tolerate drought or heavy rain, and grew well even in short growing seasons. That made it ideal for northern and central European climates, where poor weather could wipe out less resilient crops. In many rural communities, rye wasn't just common, it was dominant. Whole villages depended on it. It was baked into dense, dark loaves that lasted for days without spoiling. It was ground into meal for porridge, fermented into rustic beers, and mixed with other flours to stretch out supplies in lean times. It also had an important role in crop rotation. Rye helped suppress weeds and improve soil structure, making it a practical addition to medieval farming cycles. Its reliability meant that while it lacked the status of finer grains, it held enormous economic and nutritional importance for ordinary people. But rye had a hidden danger, one that wasn't understood for centuries. When the weather turned damp during harvest or storage, a fungus called ergot could grow on the rye kernels. It was hard to detect. Sometimes it just looked like the grain was slightly discolored or oversized. But ergot was toxic. Consuming it led to a condition known as ergotism, with symptoms that were as terrifying as they were mysterious: burning sensations in the limbs, intense hallucinations, muscle spasms, convulsions, and in severe cases, tissue death due to restricted blood flow. Limbs turned black and brittle, sometimes falling off entirely. Whole villages suffered outbreaks, which were often misattributed to witchcraft or divine punishment. The most notorious name for it was St. Anthony's Fire, a phrase that still appears in historical medical texts. People afflicted would sometimes be taken to monasteries for healing, not knowing the very bread that sustained them was the source of their suffering. Even so, rye remained in use. It had to. There were few alternatives that could survive the same conditions, so people rolled the dice. In some places, traditional wisdom eventually helped reduce risk, such as discarding shriveled kernels or soaking grain before milling. But these methods were not universally known or practiced. Ironically, what made rye a survivor crop, its hardiness and ability to grow in wet climates, was also what made it vulnerable to one of the most dangerous threats of medieval agriculture. And yet, it fed millions. Because for every horror story, there were hundreds of families who lived because rye grew when nothing else would. It was a grain of resilience, but also a grim reminder that not all dangers wore a blade. Spelt, the super grain they never forgot. Spelt wasn't flashy, it wasn't refined or easy to process, but it fed more people for longer than almost any other grain in medieval Europe. It grew where wheat failed, on rocky soil, in cold climates with fewer inputs. Its tough outer husk made it harder to mill, but that same husk protected it from pests and moisture during storage. That meant it could be stored through harsh winters without spoiling. In times of scarcity, spelt was the difference between hunger and harvest. Villages relied on it not just as a crop, but as a kind of insurance. Nutritionally, it was ahead of its time. Higher in fiber, protein, and minerals than modern wheat, spelt filled the stomach and kept energy steady during long days of labor. It was baked into dark, dense loaves, stirred into thick porridges, even brewed into rustic beer. Over time, industrial milling pushed it aside in favor of grains that were faster, whiter, and more uniform. Spelt became a relic, but now it's making a comeback, not just in health food stores, but on regenerative farms and in climate-resilient food systems. Because what once saved medieval peasants might be exactly what we need again. And we told the full story of spelt, its rise, disappearance, and return in a dedicated deep dive. Medieval peasants didn't have luxury, they didn't have technology, but they had knowledge, passed down, tested, and refined by generations who learned to survive with what the land gave them. And maybe that's the part we've forgotten. That food isn't just about abundance. It's about resilience, adaptability, community. Today, as we face our own uncertainties, climate shifts, rising costs, fragile systems, it's worth asking, are we as prepared as they were? Because the wisdom buried in those old fields might be exactly what we need to plant again.